Perhaps the only thing to beat the first PlayStation in fame is its successor, Sony Playstation 2. Hardly surprising, considering the record-holding 155 million sold consoles and the game library full of hits. Apart from these famous achievements, the second Sony console's history of creation is no less curious than that of the first one, and it's definitely worth familiarizing yourself with it. So today, we'll be talking about why PS2 disguised itself as a DVD player, what does David Lynch have to do with its creation, and of course, what games did we play on this legendary console. Oddly enough, the development of the second PlayStation began with an impasse of sorts. After the success of the PS1, the developers from Sony had no idea how to make their second console just as successful. This was due to the fact that not only did they have to attract a new audience and keep the old one, but also to move on to a new generation of gaming systems. Sony had not yet faced such a challenge, which affected the nature of their future presentations. Even before PS2 was shown to the world, the developers were trying to surprise journalists by the graphical technologies that were planned to be used in the games. To this end, special demo videos were created. Their goal was to say, look, here's what to expect. Thanks to this, Sony was able to raise the hype without showing any new titles or even the look of the console. Fortunately, those expectations were met. As we know from the last video, PS2 was even more performative than the Dreamcast. The processor bitrate, the frequency were higher, and in addition, there was an extremely powerful vector processor. Plus, PS2 had twice as much random access memory, 32 megabytes against 16. But the Dreamcast had more video random access memory, 8 megabytes against 4, which is why in certain PlayStation ports, for example, the textures are more blurry when comparing to the Dreamcast. Although the Dreamcast hardly won anything from it, and if you somehow missed the details, I invite you to have a gander at our previous video about consoles. Sony got tangled in its own promises, which is why the launch lineup of games looked big, yet hardly sparked any interest even in the US, let alone Japan. To make matters worse, the first PlayStation was still quite popular and was even receiving hits like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. At this point, the developers saved themselves by making two decisions. The first one was to make PS1 discs fully compatible with the new console. This alleviated the situation a bit, because the old library wasn't going anywhere, and even the release of new games didn't mean any competition between Sony's consoles. By the way, because of this, almost everything I told you about the first PlayStation in the corresponding video is still relevant here, so I advise you to watch it if you haven't already. The second decision was a bit weirder, to promote the PS2 as a DVD player. Of course, game advertising and game marketing was still a #1 priority, but the opportunity to watch your favorite movie on a device that costs significantly less than your usual DVD player was a surprisingly strong argument. However, even that wasn't the oddest thing the PS2 marketing gave birth to. In order to stand out against Nintendo products, the console was positioned as an entertainment device for adult and respectable gamers. This resulted in a series of rather weird commercials. For example, one of them showed a very bizarre looking girl reflecting on the intellectual enrichment of mankind. Interesting thoughts, but what did they have to do with the console is unclear. Another video showed Sony's final gaming system, the PlayStation 9. The idea was great, as it implied that the PS2 is just a step towards the bright virtual future. However, the PS2 itself wasn't even mentioned in the video, when it definitely should have been, in my humble opinion. The peak of advertising madness was achieved by the video called The Third Place, shot by the legend himself, David Lynch. In it, some guy was making his way through a dark corridor full of traps and graphical effects. At the end of the corridor, he encountered his own clone, a mummy and a duck wearing a suit, who said,
"Welcome to the third place."
If you were left wondering, what the hell was that after watching it, you were not the only one. But let's leave the analysis of these peculiar videos to the experts and move on to the games. all the more since the second PlayStation has hits for any taste. I'll start with one of the console's top exclusives, Shadow of the Colossus. It's a third-person adventure where we, as a warrior named Wander, set out to hunt down 16 giant colossi. The motivation behind such an adventure was, of course, the need to save the protagonist's loved one. The plot didn't offer anything special, but the gameplay at the time was quite surprising. First of all, the player was not forced to follow a predetermined storyline. You're free to go anywhere you want and chase any Colossus after the first temple fight. By the way, you had to search for them for yourself in the vast in-game world. Then, you had to figure out each giant's vulnerabilities and the most suitable style of combat, all while memorizing their attack patterns. Naturally, at the start the protagonist was given a sword, a bow with arrows, and a trusty steed. But compared to half-hour tutorials of some other games, Shadow of the Colossus gave you a feeling of freedom. Combined with a stunning visual style and intriguing storyline, it was such a unique adventure that before the re-releases, people would purchase a PS2 just for this game. But let's suppose that you'd like to try something a bit more straight, but equally groundbreaking. In that case, you should try Resident Evil 4, another installment of the famous series that redefined good old survivor horror. First of all, it brought the familiar over-the-shoulder perspective to 3D shooters. Firstly, it made the protagonist much more agile and therefore reduced the degree of danger. And secondly, after beating the classic parts of the series, this game was astonishingly comfortable to play. And despite the reduced amount of spookiness, Resident Evil 4 was still a B-horror movie. They even added an enemy with a chainsaw. The story was fitting. Leon Kennedy, whom we know from the second part, arrives at a Spanish village in search of the president's daughter, but finds the local equivalent of zombies, a religious cult, a castle with its insane owner, and a military base, and God knows what else. It's worth mentioning that despite the upgrade of the gameplay, it still wasn't that dynamic. And those players who craved for that kind of serious and absurd atmosphere but would like more action were out to try Devil May Cry. By the way, the series was born from an early version of Resident Evil 4, which is very noticeable in the first Devil May Cry game. The second one turned out to be rather unsuccessful and is not usually mentioned in fine company. But Devil May Cry 3 turned out to be the series recipe on the second PlayStation. I would recommend starting your acquaintance with the adventures of the demon hunter Dante with this game. Plus, the franchise's storyline begins in the third part. In it, young Dante barely opens his office when he receives a not-so-friendly message from his twin brother. Then, a bunch of demons appear and tear the office down, forcing our protagonist to go to a family reunion.
This party's getting crazy. Let's rock.
Devil May Cry is still famous for its insane combat system, but it was in this game where it achieved its full potential. You could slice your enemies in close combat with one set of weapons and shoot them from a distance with another. And with the help of jumps, rolls, and the ability to hold your opponent in the air, the player was able to perform extremely stylish combos. Later in story, Dante was also given the ability to use the demonic form to deprive the opponents of the slightest chance to win. But don't think that DMC was all about fun and games. The possibility to die on a single boss some 10 times in a row forced you to dive into the intricacies of demon slaying to be able to perform spectacular moves and squeeze the ever-living shit from the style meter. Okay, you may say, but is there something more fairy tale-y and fantasy-like? In that case, the Kingdom Hearts series is worth taking a look. It's a colorful action RPG with one of the most non-obvious concepts imaginable. I mean seriously, who would have thought that a crossover between Final Fantasy and Disney animated movies will become so popular? Here, we have a dynamic game full of epic melee fights, and all of it takes place in locations we're familiar with since childhood. The gameplay is so captivating that it doesn't really matter how strange it is to watch a dead serious scene of anime guys talking to Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse. Kingdom Hearts has an enormous and intertwined story, the essence of which boils down to the following. There is a universe that unites different worlds. Most of these worlds are Disney ones. Every creature has some sort of heart and essence that makes it possible to feel emotions. It can be lost, which splits the creature into a husk called Nobody, and the heart itself, which turns into a Heartless. It is possible to defeat a Heartless with a special key-shaped blade, in which case both entities will die and the creature's heart will go to the Kingdom Hearts. Local villains strive to conquer this realm to obtain infinite power, while the heroes try to protect it. So this isn't just an opportunity to fight Cerberus from Hercules. Or take Okami for example, an equally fascinating game that uses the fantasy of ancient Japanese legends rather than classic fairy tales. It's an action-adventure about the sun goddess with a peculiar name, Amaterasu, who has taken the form of a wolf and is fighting the powerful demon named Orochi. The story is based on Japanese mythology and has many references to it. By the way, for those who would like to get acquainted with this worthy game, I hasten to warn you about tons of dialogues. For the most part, they are quite interesting, but at times there's simply too much of them, and the ability to skip dialogues was only added in the HD re-release of Okami. The game's graphics continues with the development of Japanese culture and philosophy. The cell shading technology makes everything look like traditional ink and paint art styles. And it's not just for fun. The main gameplay gimmick is the sky brush, which allowed you to pause the game and draw all kinds of various objects. For instance, the player could slice enemies by crossing them out, draw a bridge to cross a river, or even depict the sun in the sky, which then indeed appeared in the game. Naturally, this was the basis for quests and puzzles, almost like in Comic Zone, but instead of the villain, it's now you who finishes everything. Thanks to such unique features, Okami has passed the test of time with flying colors, and even now, it will be quite interesting to play.
The gods of Olympus have abandoned me.
When you start to grow tired of all these Japanese anime stuff, you can launch God of War, another great exclusive of the era till the next gen re-releases. Unlike the stylish and refined heroes of the previous games, here we took on the role of Kratos, a brutal Spartan warrior and soon to become the God of War. Gameplay wise, the game was like a slasher, reminiscent of DMC, but to fit the main character, the combat and the story were more serious, brutal, and gory. Of course, on his path, Kratos had to face numerous enemies and puzzles inherent to the genre. Going back to the topic of positioning the PS2, this was a perfect example of how Sony tried to target the adult audience. And unlike questionable commercials, this step towards more mature players turned out to be much more effective. The reinterpretation of Greek mythology and face-melting action entailed not only the success of the first God of War, but a whole franchise which is relevant to this day. Nowadays, every protagonist is a Leon, annihilating packs of zombies one after another. To take something more down to earth and realistic, on the second PlayStation, you can't go past the sequels of Metal Gear Solid. And as much as I personally love the second installment, for the most part, it took the original MGS and multiplied it by 2 in each and every aspect. It's more interesting to talk about Metal Gear Solid 3, which brought significant changes to the series' gameplay. Here, we have another third party in a franchise, which actually acts as the first in the series. Consequently, we were playing not as Solid Snake, but as his father, Naked Snake, later known in the MGS's lore as Big Boss. Various cool gadgets also haven't been brought in yet, so we have to do some honest stealth with cover and camouflage. The game's story was unfolding in the forests of Siberia. The question of what are crocodiles doing in Siberia is left unanswered. The main thing for which the third MGS was and is still appreciated is the fact that it mocks spy action movies of the 80s and lets us plunge into its atmosphere all at the same time. The familiar variability of task solving was pleasing. You could act stealthy like Hitman or Sam Fisher, or be up for a gunfight like James Bond. To sum up, just like in 1996, we were once again plunged into a terrific game film which simply couldn't let you go. Practically any of our videos include some cool racing game. Now is the right time to talk about Gran Turismo, especially since the awesome fourth part of this series was released exclusively for PS2. To begin with, the game had two main modes. The first one was a standard arcade mode, where you could simply have fun racing around, enjoy truly beautiful cars and tracks, and appreciate the realistic physics. Now, of course, it no longer seems so flawless, but in comparison with arcade Need for Speeds of the time, this game was much more closer to the real driving simulators. The second mode of the game was called Gran Turismo, and it immersed us in the career of a racing car driver. As in any racing game, here we were participating in various races to win money and use it to upgrade old cars and buy new ones. But the classic gameplay was complemented by some interesting details. For example, to advance the career, the racers needed licenses of different levels. To get them, you essentially had to pass a driving test by performing tough turns, accelerate and slow down at the right time, and so on. Apart from racing licenses, the game had full-blown racing missions where you had to accomplish a certain objective in certain conditions. For example, you're in an old pickup in Los Angeles in the rush hour and have to reach the state's border in under 30 minutes. Otherwise, you'll get fired. Well, I mean, the missions weren't that hardcore, but you get the idea. And then there were all sorts of professional leagues, rallies, enormous races to test your endurance, and so on. All in all, Gran Turismo portrayed motorsport in all its glory. And sometimes you want to do a little bit of everything. To drive around, to shoot some guns, to follow the story, or to just do silly stuff in the in-game world. Perhaps there is no better place to do all of the above than in the Grand Theft Auto series. The franchise's precipice at the time, released for PS2, was San Andreas, the fifth game in the series. If you count the two-dimensional parts, the game could have been called a life simulator if your life was filled with street gang wars. I'm sure that the story of San Andreas is known to everyone, but just in case, allow me to remind you. The game's protagonist, Carl Johnson, better known as CJ, receives the news of his mother's death and returns to his hometown.
Oh shit, here we go again.
CJ finds his ghetto on the decline, after which the long and arduous path to success for both our hero and his street gang begins. The gameplay is actually a bit hard to describe. On one hand, it's a simple run, shoot and drive. On the other hand, a rather big imaginary state of San Andreas had ton of activities to offer, ranging from gyms, clothing shops and hair salons to opportunities to bet on horses, rob houses, or vice versa, catch criminals with your own hands. Although most often we would just enter a weapon cheat code and have a war with in-game cops. The amounts of content can be seen even in the numerous Easter eggs. A huge constellation of stars in the night sky that copies Rockstar logo is the tip of the Easter egg iceberg. And if San Andreas in all its variety somehow managed to get boring, the PS2 version, as well as the Xbox version by the way, could offer multiplayer. It wasn't exactly convenient because both characters had to stay on the screen, but who cares if you could play GTA together. It ended up officially being the best-selling game on the PlayStation 2, and rightly so, in my opinion. Let's end today's video by saying a few words about mascots that simply must be mentioned in order for the video to be considered complete. Crash Bandicoot, after his success on the PS1, was now migrating from one developer to another, and although its sequels were of quite a decent quality, it's hard to call him the mascot of the second PlayStation. Ratchet and Clank A series of games that was first released for PS2 and is still relevant today is more likely to take that role. The third installment, titled Up Your Arsenal, was the one I, and judging by the reviews, many other fans remembered the most. It was a third-party person action with shooter elements, so we had to run, jump, and do some not so realistic but extremely fun shooting. The protagonist's name is Ratchet, who is a member of the Lombax race, which resembles small animals. Sometimes we had to play as his companion, Clank the robot. Throughout many games in the series, this duo opposed the evil Dr. Nefarious, the leader of the equally evil Tyrannoid race. The third Ratchet, in keeping with the best traditions of the series, stood out for its appealing visual style, reminiscent of space fiction cartoons. In such an atmosphere, it was quite pleasant to explore levels filled not only with enemies, but also with secrets like hidden locations. As in the GTA, here we were also offered the multiplayer mode, which first appeared in the third installment. It had the classic modes of the time, deathmatch, siege and capture the flag, which was not exactly impressive even then. However, the gameplay and controls were done well enough that multiplayer fights felt quite good as they were. That's why I remember Ratchet and Clank as both another great game to beat and a good place for multiplayer brawls. To sum it all up, even in such a lengthy video, I was unable to cover all the worthy masterpieces for the PlayStation 2. But even without that, it is clear that the main advantage of the console was a terrific game library, where you can find great games for any taste. So for me personally, there is nothing surprising about the extreme popularity of the PS2 and its leadership in the 6th generation of consoles. As for other great games, that's where I invite you to the comment section. Looking forward to read your recommendations about which PS2 games are worth trying out. As always, like and subscribe for more great content. See you on Drigmatic.